In our previous videos, we looked into how to create new types of content assets and add them to the engine, and also how to customize their look and feel using custom asset type actions. In this last segment, I'd like to go over how to create a custom asset editor. A custom asset editor allows you to replace the default user interface for an asset, which is really just a details panel. So if you have a more complex asset, such as a material or blueprint, for example, you can open a user interface that is geared specifically towards that asset. And the main entry point for making that possible is also the asset actions interface that we discussed previously. There is a method called Open Asset Editor. Let's see if we can find it in the editor in Visual Studio. It's right here at the very bottom, Open Asset Editor. So that function is called every time the user wishes to open an asset editor. And remember, you can double-click on a single asset to bring up its editor, but you could also select multiple assets and right-click and say Edit, and then it will open up two separate asset editors. So that's why this function actually gets a collection of U objects. So these are all the U objects that are supposed to be edited. And then the only thing that we do in here is we iterate over this collection of objects, and we try to cast it to a text asset, and if that succeeds, it means that the current object being iterated is a text asset. So we open a text asset editor for that object. And you may see the code here refers to it as toolkit. That's because the internal name of asset editors is toolkit. So those two names, asset editor and toolkits, they're interchangeable. In code, you will mostly see the term toolkit. But when you read the documentation, people mostly refer to it as asset editors. All right, let's look at some of the code. We obviously don't have time to implement an entire asset editor from scratch, but the good thing is I've already done all the work for you, so we can just take a look at the code that's already there. Perhaps let's take one more look at the opening of the asset editor itself. You see we're creating a new instance of ftext asset editor toolkit, and then in the next line we're initializing it, and that will cause it to show up in the editor. The declaration of this class, this toolkit, is in text asset editor / toolkits / text asset editor toolkit.h. And you see this is a somewhat bigger C++ class. Most importantly, it inherits from asset editor toolkit, which is the base class for all asset editors. I'm also inheriting undo client to provide undo and redo functionalities, but I haven't actually implemented those yet, so they're still empty. And most of the work happens inside the initialize function, which remember we're calling from here to set everything up. So let's take a look at that. There's quite a bit of code in here. Notice that the first thing we're doing is to set up a slate layout. This whole block of code is a single expression that declares a slate tab layout. Why do we do that? Well, let's open up this asset editor. You will notice that everything in this window actually consists of little tabs. You see, I can drag out the toolbar, pop it out, I can pop it back in or pop it to the side. Makes probably the most sense at the top. I can drag this out too, and so on. So this window basically contains a slate tab manager, and the layout specifies how the individual tabs are arranged within this window. And that's what we're doing here. So you see we're creating a primary area, and then the splitters that we're adding are the little draggable areas that we're creating here. So every time you add a new tab splitter, it basically inserts a new area for docking where you can dock your tabs into. So it looks a little convoluted, but if you look at it closely, it's pretty straightforward. There are some attributes we're setting here. For example, initially we want to hide the tab wall. The tab walls are these little things here that you can show and hide. That's called the tab wall. So not really any rocket science in here. And then finally, we call the initialization function in the base class. And this is where all the integration with the editor happens. So that's where the code is that makes your asset editor window show up. Okay, let's scroll down a little further and look at some of the other things we have in here. This function is interesting, register tab spawners. So up here, we're just declaring the layout of how the tabs should be arranged. And we're also saying that, for example, in this particular slot, we want to add the toolbar tab, which is this little thing here. That's the toolbar tab. But this doesn't actually create the tab. The editor at some later point in time will call into our Windows Tab Manager to instantiate the tabs that we're registering here in our layout. So the layout is kept separate from the actual instantiation of all the tabs, which allows you to swap out the layout at runtime, or more importantly, it also allows the user to save the layout to disk and store it in the ini file, so it can be reloaded in the same exact state at a later time, next time the editor is opened. And this code is where we are registering the functions that will perform the creation of the tabs. Those are called tab spawners. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you will actually see the callback delegate that will eventually get called to instantiate tabs. So in this case, this callback, I called it handle tab manager spawn tab. And here we're just basically checking which tab the editor wishes to create. And if it happens to be the tab widget that we wish to create, then we're just generating the slate widget right there. You've already seen the asNew macro in a previous video when I talked about composing Slate UI widgets. All right, yeah, so here we just we create the widget that's going to be shown inside the tab, and then finally we're creating the tab itself, which is also a widget, and then we're putting the content inside of it. Now, in this case, the tab that we're creating is very simple. It's just this thing here on the bottom. The toolbar at the top is actually created for us by the base class. We don't have to do anything for that. All asset editors automatically have this tab. So we're really only handling the tab at the bottom here, which will show a multi-line text box. Now, I could have just created a multi-line text box here and inserted that, but that wouldn't quite work, because then the text box, it needs to show the actual text content of our text asset. So there are some things that I have to wire up, and we have to track if the text changes. We need to update our text property on the asset, and so on. So there's some logic required for that multi-line text box to work properly. So I decided to just put that code into a separate class in order to not further convolute the code that's in our toolkit right here. And that class I called asTextAssetEditor, and you can find it in the widgets folder of that module. Let's open it up real quick. And you see it's a regular Slate widget. It looks very similar to the Slate widgets I've shown you previously. In this case, it doesn't declare any attributes. that are exposed for use by other widgets or by the user. Our constructor method, we've seen that. This is what actually creates the widget contents. And then here we have just a bunch of callback delegates that handle various input events from the user. When the text has changed, when the text has been committed by the user, or when the property has changed on our asset. For example, it's possible that something changes the content of this asset's text field while we have an asset editor for it open. So we got to make sure that these two are synchronized. And let's take a quick look at the implementation. And again, this should look familiar to you at this point. Here we have the declarative syntax to create the text asset editor widget itself, which in this case it's super simple. It's just a vertical box that contains an editable text box. I didn't actually need to wrap it in a vertical box, but I was planning to add some more features to this UI in the future, perhaps some buttons at the bottom to manipulate the text. So it can't hurt to already have a vertical box, and then I can just add more vertical box slots later and add more stuff to it. And yeah, here are the callback handlers. At the bottom, you can find the implementations for each of them, and this is how we register them. So the multi-line editable text box widget happens to expose event delegates. In this case, we're using onTextChanged and onTextCommitted, and then we're just registering a callback function that will be executed whenever those events happen. So if, for example, the user is typing into our text field, then we will execute this code right there. And this particular line just causes our text asset to be marked dirty, which means that in practice, as soon as we start typing here, you should notice a little star should show up on the bottom. There it is. So this means that our asset has been modified and it should be saved. If you don't save it, then changes might get lost. Yeah, and that's really all that this particular line does. All right, and the rest should be pretty self-explanatory. And let me see, do we need to cover anything else? I decided to have a custom style class. There's not really a whole lot in here. It's in fact an empty style that is just supposed to show you how to implement a Slate widget style so that you can customize the look and feel of your user interface. A style class is pretty straightforward also. It's a regular C++ class that implements it's inherited from Slate style set. And this is some boilerplate. You'll see just some helpers for commonly used icon dimensions, for example. And then here, this line is where you would put all your actual style customizations. I put one in here that's disabled just for demonstration purposes, but this is, for example, how you would declare an image style for a button. Like, let's say if you wanted to show an image inside a button. If you're curious, there are some good examples in the engine for styling in general. Most of the styles, let me see, most of the styles are located in the Slate core style and also the Slate editor style files. And let me see if I can find at least one of them. And one last thing you can look at is Slate styles. I have a little example here. It doesn't actually do much. If you open up text asset editor style underneath the Slate folder, it will show you how to start implementing your own widget style. And you can use this to replace how widgets are rendered. What kind of images are used and what kind of colors and so on. So this one doesn't actually do much. It just has some basic boilerplate. right here is the spot where you would start adding your own styles. I just have a little placeholder here for a fancy button that I made up. If you want to dive a little deeper into Slate styles, I suggest you go into two of the style files that we have in the engine. That's Slate Core Style and Slate Editor Style. If you open those up, you will get a lot of ideas of what you can do, how to customize colors and icons, and you see this file is pretty big. There's a lot of stuff in here. Alrighty, so that covers pretty much custom content asset editors. And even though we haven't been able to go into all the details, and like I said, custom editors can be very complicated. It's really up to you. I hope that you at least got an understanding of how these things work and how they are created. So here's a quick summary. Custom asset editors allow you to replace the user interface for your custom asset types. Instead of showing the standard details panel, you can show whatever user interface you wish. And the internal name for asset editors is toolkits. So when you search the code, you will see toolkit a lot instead of asset editor. They're all implemented in the Slate user interface framework. I've shown you how to do that. And again, if you want to learn more about how existing asset editors are implemented, to use it as an example, use our widget reflector to dive into that code and learn more about how that works. And that concludes our video series for today. So here are the things that you should have learned. I have shown you how to create a code project. Then we have created a code plugin that is inside the project. I also showed you how to add new types of content assets to the engine. Then we looked at how to customize the look and feel of those new asset types. We also learned how users are able to create these asset types using factories. And then finally, we had a quick glance at how to implement a custom asset editor user interface. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed the series, and I see you next time. Bye-bye.